This is my second Smash Up faction video, and in this video I'm going to discuss both the vampires and the shapeshifters. Two factions that excel in multiplayer games and happen to work well together. Strategically speaking, the vampires do suck a little bit, but many players make them suck even worse than they have to by focusing on a rather ineffective destruction package. In fact, you should play the vampires as a power counter faction first, and a destruction package second, since this way you only end up emphasizing the destruction package when it actually works. The shapeshifters, in contrast, are a much stronger faction. While they aren't great in a two-player game, they have three different strengths that play very well in multiplayer. They can play minions directly out of their deck without having drawn them, which is excellent in excessively short four-player games where you often won't draw your best cards. They can copy opposing minion abilities, which of course gets better the more different opponents you have, and they can copy opposing minion power, which also gets better the more minions you have to copy. As a result, in a four-player game, I consider them one of the big four factions alongside robots, zombies, and geeks. And in most situations, the shapeshifters are every bit as powerful as these three more obvious power factions. So here we have all the different vampires cards. And strategically speaking, the vampires have three cards, Call to Weak, and two copies of Crack of Dusk, which you should try to play for impact. They have one card, Big Gulp, which you should play to solve a problem, and be a little bit greedy about trying to get a lot out of it. And with the rest of the cards in faction, you should just try to get small amounts of value out of them and not be too greedy. Because being greedy with any of the other cards tends to either make you play too slow or opens you up to tactical problems. So let's start with the destruction package, because this is sort of what most people look at when they look at the vampires first. Night Stalker is a slightly better Laceratops. If it kills a minion, it gets a +1 power counter, so it always adds at least 3 power to a base when you play it, rather than maybe being a 2. And there isn't much to say about it other than that it's a slightly better Laceratops. Your opponent in a two-player game will play to make Night Stalker awkward if they can by only playing 2 power minions when you find it inconvenient, and you're just going to have to deal with that. Dinner Date is a little bit nicer card because it gives you a +1 counter even if you don't manage to destroy a minion, and as a result you can play it either aggressively to increase the power at a base or defensively to decrease the power at a base. Of course, its main problem is it only moves the base by 1 point either way, but at least it's got some flexibility. Finally, Big Gulp is the threat that prevents your opponent from going too crazy with 3 and 4 power minions. You want to hold on to this card unless you're getting a lot of value or stopping a definite threat with it, since there's only one copy, and as soon as it's gone, your opponent knows that your vampires can only kill small stuff and will play like it. Next up, we have the little grower package the vampires have. The Count and Opportunist both provide the same ability. Whenever somebody else's minions die, you get a +1 counter. Now, +1 counter is not very much, and as a result, trying to get value out of these ends up being a very slow plan. And slow in Smash Up is usually bad. The one way you can get value out of your grower package is to put Opportunist on one minion and then play the Count at the same base as Opportunist. In a multiplayer game, this can be a pretty strong incentive for your opponents to actually play at the base you're at. And since getting isolated alone at a base is really bad in a 3 or 4 player game of Smash Up, this can help encourage people to play along with your vampires. Summon Wolves is a little bit more dangerous card. It gets its power counters even if you don't kill anything, but I should warn you of a tactical problem with Summon Wolves. In a two-player game, if you're facing an opponent who can either destroy it or, Dracula forbid, move it from one base to another, letting your summon wolves gets too big tends to give your opponent too much tactical control of the game. So most of the time you should play summon wolves either as a multiplayer incentive for your opponents to join you as at a base, or in single player just play it as a card that gets you 1 point closer to breaking the base on your own turn than your opponent was on their last turn. Mad Monster Party, it's awkward, it won't get you a lot of value. Buffet, it will mostly do something useful when you are already winning the game anyway. Now we come to one of the more interesting and one of the more useless cards in the set, Heavy Drinker. You may destroy one of your minions to place a +1 power counter on this minion. And there's one important thing to know about Heavy Drinker. A minion is worth a lot more than a +1 power counter. When you place a +1 power counter on your minion, first off, the minion you killed was probably more than 1 power. And second off, you've just added value to any destruction or return to hand effect your opponent has that doesn't check for minion power. So against certain opposing factions, aliens and time travelers come to mind. Power counters are actually really bad. On the other hand, there are a few situations in which Heavy Drinker can be really good. If you can get a VP for killing your own minion, then all of a sudden Heavy Drinker is a really good card. As a matter of fact, in a lot of cases, if I get a VP for killing my own minion, I will just play the Heavy Drinker at the base and have the Heavy Drinker kill itself. The power counter will fail, but the VP was generally worth a lot more than 1 power, and this lets me save a tempo on playing a second minion, which is usually more valuable than the +1 counter anyway. You might think that Heavy Drinker is a good card in combination with the Kitty Cats, who temporarily gain control of enemy minions. But the problem with playing Vampire Kitty Cats is that the Kitty Cats generally already have better things to do with a captured minion than gaining a single +1 power counter from it. So as a result, you're not really going to find yourself using Heavy Drinker. Some players also like to play it with Tricksters so that they can play a Gremlin and then sacrifice the Gremlin to a Heavy Drinker and get a +1 power counter and draw a card and make their opponent discard a card at random. Guess what? A minion is still more valuable than those 3 effects added together. So in general, Heavy Drinker, don't try to break it too hard. You might occasionally get useful plays in combination with the Zombie's Tenacious Z, but most of the time you only really use it if you're getting VP straight out of it. Alright, so after all of those cards I've warned you not to be too greedy with, we come to the 2 cards that you really do want to be greedy with. Call the Weak is the simple card. This card you want to play on the last base of the game, or maybe the second last, and discard a bunch of stuff into it to add a bunch of +1 counters. In a 2-player game, you want to break the base on the same turn you play it so you don't give your opponent an option to respond to it by either slightly trumping your power total, or returning your minion to your hand, or moving it from one base to another, or doing something else that makes your Call the Weak play look stupid and useless. Crack of Dusk is the card that you're going to be using more early in mid-game. Play a minion of power 2 or less from your discard, and give it a +1 counter. And this is sort of the vampire's version of augmentation. Now, unfortunately, due to the way triggered effects are processed, if you use this on Fledgling Vampire, which checks to see if any of your opponents have more power than you two before adding a +1 counter, you're going to have to add the counter from Crack of Dusk before you check Fledgling Vampire to see if it gets an additional counter. So in order to get full value out of Crack of Dusk Fledgling Vampire, you're going to need to have an opponent who has at least 4 power more than you at that base before playing it. And as a result, you'll normally play Crack of Dusk first and then play your normal minion play. In the Vampire Shapeshifters, you're going to see me emphasize combining Crack of Dusk Occasionally with this guy, who copies an opposing minion's ability, but mainly you're aiming to use this guy, who counts as a minion of power 2 or less until he comes into play, but depending on what your opponent has in play, he might be a 4 or a 5 as soon as he enters play, plus the +1 counter, and that makes Crack of Dusk a seriously good card. Here we have the Shapeshifters, juggernauts in 4-player games, especially against inexperienced opponents. And there's 2 different card sets that make them especially good in games with 4 players. First off, we have their small minions. Copycat copies opposing minions' abilities. Mimic copies either friendly or opposing minions' base power. And for obvious reasons, the more opponents you have, the more different possibilities you have for stuff that you can copy with these 2 cards. But there's a second effect that makes these 2 cards good in games with multiple opponents. If you're playing a 2-player game and you only have 1 opponent, you're your opponent's only opponent, which means that all their defensive energy is going to go into restricting your options with Copycat and Mimic. And so you'll probably get a lot less value out of these 2 cards. In a 4-player game, though, each of your opponents has 2 other opponents besides you, and individually, they all find it a little less important to restrict your Mimics or restrict your Copycats, and as a result, you'll tend to get better plays out of these cards. Now, there's a second package which also focuses the Shapeshifters a little bit on larger games. And this is the Doppelganger Transmogrify package, and Gelf to a lesser extent. All of these cards allow you to play minions directly from your deck into play, which does a fantastic job of making your deck more consistent in drawing the right minions early, helps give you a higher chance of drawing a strong early hand. But over the course of a long game, the build for this is going to come due when you find yourself drawing fewer good minions late in the game. In a 2-player game, the Shapeshifters have a tendency to flame out in long games. A lot of the time, if you get to a close endgame with the Shapeshifters in a 2-player game, you're just going to lose. Because if you were going to have enough gas to win that endgame, you would have hit 15 points significantly before your opponent anyway. On the other hand, the more players you have in the game, once you're scoring 3rd place points as well as 1st and 2nd from every base, the game tends to end in fewer turns. And as a result, the Shapeshifters may just win the game before depleting their deck becomes a problem. And so both of these effects make the Shapeshifters a lot better in games with more players. Now, as far as playing with and against the Shapeshifters, for playing Copycat, it's important as the Shapeshifters to know what different minions you're going to be facing, and just make a mental note of how much value you can expect out of a Copycat in this game. When playing against the Copycat, it's important to understand what you're going to have to end your turn with that Mimic in play, minion, not Mimic, and what minions you can maybe finesse in such a way that they're never in play at the start of the Shapeshifter's turn. For instance, you generally do not want to let the Shapeshifters copy an invader if you can help it, unless you're well ahead of them on the scoreboard, and them scoring VP directly isn't a problem for you. Mimic is pretty simple. As a guideline, I would say count on getting at least 3 power out of a Mimic in a 2-player game, count on getting about 4 on average in a 3-player game, and count on sometimes getting 5 with 4 players. In Vampire Shapeshifters specifically, Crack of Dusk, Mimic can let you score 5 or 6 points of minion power with a single action play, which is pretty good. And because of that combination, you want to try to get a Mimic in your discard very early when playing with the Vampires. But otherwise, Even though you're going to see me trying to get a Mimic in my discard early, in this video, if you are not playing with the vampires, your Mimics are a precious resource. Because they're 0 printed power, Transmogrify and really can search for them by destroying any minion you have. You don't need to worry about it having enough power. You would have to destroy a 5-power minion to go search for a doppelganger. Your Gelfs can also search for them, and so they're going to be the easiest high-value minion that you can get your hands on. Having no minions left in your deck is actually a significant problem for the Shapeshifters, and it's one of the reasons they start to run out of gas and get worse late in a game. So be careful about depleting your Mimic supply. Gelf is mainly a consistency card. It's often just going to be a 4, but it makes sure that your Mimics and your copycats are more likely to be effectively in your hand ready to play. It also, if you're playing Alien Shapeshifters, helps deal with a problem that Aliens decks often have, which is that if they don't draw their Invader, they are much, much worse. Alien Shapeshifters is one of my preferred Shapeshifter combinations, partially because the Gelfs help make Invaders more consistent, partially also because I'm combining a 2-player focused faction with a 4-player focused faction, and so I can just pick the Alien Shapeshifters deck and not worry about how many players will be sitting at the table. It's going to be about equally good anyway. Doppelganger. The one important point I'll make about Doppelganger is that sometimes you want to try to get value out of it a little later in the game than you might otherwise, because whatever minion you are going to pull out with Doppelganger, once you've pulled it out of your deck with Doppelganger, you can't draw it anymore. So sometimes the best time to play Doppelganger is about on the 3rd to last base of the game. Important points to say about really Transmogrify and Back to the Future. None of these cards say 2. You can use all of them with an indestructible minion to fail to destroy that minion and still get the card's effect. However, while you do have a card that can make one of your minions indestructible, the plan of playing Shell Game on something and then transmogrifying it tends to be too slow in practice. Most of the time what happens is you play Shell Game to create the threat of a transmogrify that won't destroy one of your minions, and this threat forces your opponent to make an aggressive play that they otherwise wouldn't want to make. Cellular Bonding is usually going to be a dead card, unfortunately. It's mainly going to rely on your opponent having something useful to copy. You usually are not going to have the time to play Splice as Nice and then copy it with Cellular Bonding. And because it's a little awkward to play when you can get value out of it, you should go for it right away. Genetic Shift is your version of Augmentation. It's just +3 power. Rarely, if you have 4 minions in play, you can get 4 power out of it. And that's the Shapeshifters. Actually, I shouldn't stop talking about the Shapeshifters without mentioning the 4-player draft metagame at least a little bit, because Shapeshifters are a top 4 faction alongside Zombies, Robots, and Geeks. And in any sort of a restricted draft where all 4 of those factions aren't available in the same draft, the Shapeshifters are just as important to pick early as the other 3. But they have one difference from the other 3, and that is Robot Zombies, Robot Geeks, and Zombie Geeks are all Tier 1 decks. And as a result, if you have all 4 of these broken factions available in the same draft, it's basically never correct to allow Robots, Zombies, or Geeks to persist past the 5th pick and risk one of your opponents getting one of those 3 decks. Granted, all 3 of those factions have Tier 1 options other than pairing up with each other, but allowing your opponent more different Tier 1 options than necessary is not going to be correct. The Shapeshifters, on the other hand, if you are playing a draft with every faction available, like you might see in an official tournament final for 4 players, You can actually afford to let the Shapeshifters sit around longer because they don't combine with the other top 4 factions as well. And so if you look at practice that occurs in people who play with draft pools that include everything, it's actually okay not to grab Shapeshifters as soon as you see them. But on the other hand, if you're drafting from a pool of 8 or 12 or 16 factions, grab the Shapeshifters. Otherwise, you're going to let one of your opponents get too strong a deck.
This is a 3-player game between the Dino Sharks playing first, the Vampire Shapeshifters playing second, and we'll see the game from their perspective, and the Mythic Greek Grannies playing third. I'm going to start by talking about the bases because these 4 opening bases dictate a clear plan. Tar Pits first, because its 9 to 16 VP to breakpoint ratio is extremely large, and the 2 VP for third place dictates that you need to score something there, even if it's the very last place. Then the Secret Volcano Headquarters is second, with 2 higher breakpoint and an ability that makes it slightly less forcing, since if you aren't there, there's about a 50% chance that you will get a minion there from its base ability. And the Homeworld is third, partially because its 7 to 23 ratio is pretty small, and also because its ability sort of encourages you to build up a strong hand and then drop a burst there. Also because the 4-2-1 VP stat line encourages players to play for first rather than second, and so if you drop a moderately large stack there, and one of your opponents can just barely trump it, you'll end up getting relatively bad value for your 2 VP. So at the start of the game, that's our plan. Tar Pits first, Secret Volcano Headquarters second, Homeworld third, unless something from the top of the base deck makes us want to play somewhere else before we get to Homeworld. Next, we should look at what plans these 4 opposing factions present us. The Vampires are going to struggle a little bit to find 2 power targets to eat because the Dinosaurs don't present any and the Sharks can play theirs reactively. The Shapeshifters need to figure out both how much power they expect from Mimic. With this fairly average set of printed power, they probably want to get about 4 power out of it normally, and what they should try to copy with Copycat. They would love to copy a War Raptor with multiple War Raptors in play, but unfortunately with the Homeworld available, 2 or more War Raptors are likely to land there in a single turn and then leave play when the base breaks, and as a result, the Dinosaurs might not even bother playing the third on some other base later. The Sharks give us their 4 and 5 power minion as interesting destruction abilities that we can copy at some point. And Great White's ability could potentially be useful tactically if we're able to play multiple copycats on the Homeworld and then move them elsewhere. The Greeks are most likely to just give us a +1 counter, and that only if we played the copycat from hand rather than via Crack of Dusk. And the Grannies are the most consistent at giving us some sort of decent copycat target. They're just going to give us a little bit of deck manipulation whenever we play a copycat, although if we manage to copy the Matriarch, we could get some real value. Finally, of course, since we're playing Vampire Shapeshifters, we want to find some opportunity during this game to play Crack of Dusk on a Mimic and get great value from that combo. So as expected, the Dino Sharks are going to open up playing at Tar Pits, and that Laceratops sets a little bit of a trap for us. If our opening hand contains Copycat, but no other minions, we won't have a minion that we can play at Tar Pits because the Copycat would be forced to copy the Laceratops ability and kill itself. Fortunately for us, we draw the Gelf, and a Splice is nice. And here I actually should have exchanged the Gelf for a Mimic before playing Splice is nice, because that way this Crack of Dusk I draw would have immediately had a Mimic in the discard to target. But as it is, at least we got the ideal amount of power we wanted. The nice thing about this 6-4 lead is that if the Greeks equal or exceed our power, the base breaks, which means that we've more or less guaranteed getting at least second place ahead of the Dino Sharks. And in this case, we actually get a 4-4-2 advantage, which is nice opening lead to have. Lake Minnetonka is a 5-3-2, but it's not quite as high a ratio, 10-26 as opposed to 9-18, as the Secret Volcano Headquarters offers, which is one reason why the Dinosaur Sharks played there. As a second reason, both the Greeks and both of our factions tend to have good slow ways to build up on large bases, so the Dinosaur Sharks probably want to encourage play at bases with lower breakpoints as much as possible. In this case, our only reasonable play is going to be just to play the Heavy Drinker. I'm just thinking about it for a little while, because the 2-power minion is too squishy and we don't have anything good to copy with it yet. But the Dinosaur Sharks strategically would like to keep play away from Lake Minnetonka, because the more total material our opponents have in play, the better Copycat gets, the better Mimic gets, and the more likely we are to have reasonable targets to eat with the vampires. Also, the Greeks have a lot of ways to slowly build up with power counters, like that Spartan we're seeing now. Now, at this point, with the Homeworld, the dinosaurs get to do one of those things they like to do, which is burst Homeworld very hard. This case, they've got a total of 18 power there to the 5 from the Greek grannies, which means they're going to jump into a 6-4 lead over us, which sucks, but we're not too unhappy about it, because that King Rex and 2 War Raptors was a lot of value in their deck, and so we've still got a reasonable position. Oracle of Delphi comes out, and since you'll notice our hand has only 2 2-power minions in it, so we would really like to draw some stuff, and that makes Oracle of Delphi someplace we really want to play. In this case, by using the Copycat's ability to copy the Granny's card, we can look at the top card of our deck, verify that it's an action, then Oracle of Delphi triggers and draws our action, which is nice. And now we can transmogrify away that vulnerable 2-power minion, get a Mimic so that we can make up for the mistake of not getting a Mimic in the discard pile to power Crack of Dusk earlier. I'm not playing it at Oracle of Delphi. I'm actually going to play it at Secret Volcano Headquarters. And this will also give us a 7-6-3 lead at Secret Volcano Headquarters. We could not have made 9 this turn, I don't believe. I think we could only have made 8, so there was no breaking and winning the base right now. But by getting a chance to draw an extra card, we're setting ourselves up well. And here we're going to see the Greek Grannies take the 8 to 7-6 lead. And of course, Secret Volcano Headquarters, being Secret Volcano Headquarters, is going to proceed to knock them back down to last place by playing a War Raptor and a Fledgling Vampire. And as a result, we end up tying for first there. The Greek Grannies, who were winning the base when it started to break, end up only getting 2 points. Now, that blood in the water might be signaling that the Sharks are planning to kill everything in sight. It might also just be a card that's nice to have in play. Since they have 2 copies of it, and they don't have a lot of draw in their deck, they might not really need the extra minion play. So this doesn't necessarily signal aggressive destruction to come. But as it is, we're going to end up copying nothing of much import and playing out our shell game in order to try and keep this guy in play, since, we don't have anything sticky right now. And drawing our Doppelganger. Now, we've drawn it early enough that we have a chance to get some huge value out of that boss minion. Of course, right after we play something to protect our minion, the Grannies decide to destroy both actions in play and draw a couple cards off of it, so we end up with a dead Copycat anyway, should the Dinosaur Sharks desire it. I actually can't remember. Okay, they do. And they get a power counter out of it. And get a Mako into play, which means that on our turn they have 5 power from the Armor Stego, 9 after Hammerhead, 11 for Mako. So it's currently 11-2 on an 18. So 5 points would grab second place for us, which just so happens to be exactly what Doppelganger has. And we would need 11 to tie for first, which just so happens to be the extra 6 that Crack of Dusk will do us. That Doppelganger allowed our Mimic to be a 5 plus the 1 counter, and so this gets us to an 11-11 tie. Now, the problem with this play is that we've just put the Dinosaur Sharks on 14 points. We would really have liked to have given them second place to tie them, but we're just going to have to deal with the fact that they're sitting at 14 and, be happy with the fact that we've buried the Mythic Greeks at 9 points. And we can also take advantage of the fact that this Doppelganger is going to get us a head start with the count on starting to win the next space. Now our plan, now that somebody's at 14 points, we're getting into an end game, and we've got to ask ourselves, how are we going to be able to win first if we take it? And the answer is we've got 2 possibilities. With one of these bases that's 4-2-1 or 5-3-2, we can either take first place with the dinosaurs having second to tie and go to overtime at either 16-16 or 17-17, depending on where it is, or we can try to hand second place to the Greek Grannies and stick the Dinosaur Sharks in third place, which would win the game outright. We cannot let a base break that we aren't winning, or even if we score second place to the Dinosaur Sharks third, they'll hit 15, we'll be sitting back at 14. And what is going on here? Oh, that's right, the Greeks are being the Greeks. So these green counters are not +1 counters, they're +1 until end of turn. And what's going on is the Greeks are using Odysseus and Hercules, to go to 15 power in a single turn, putting themselves back in the game with 4 points to go to 13, but also letting us get the second place from the count and we go to 14. And this is one reason why it's nice to be the one player with stuff in play, because that count scored us 2 VP right there. So now we're at a really tricky spot in play. Everyone is 1 base win away from winning the game. And we have a hand where we have a copycat that can copy not much of anything, and we've got essentially a 3 power if we play it at Minnetonka, fledgling vampire. And Minnetonka essentially has a slightly lower breakpoint than the printed 26 because of its ability. Whenever you play or move a minion to here, it gains +1 power until the end of the turn. So Minnetonka can be treated as being either a 25 or 24 for the most part. So the main issue I've got right now is that really is my only really powerful extra play. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use the really to get a Mimic into play right away. This is going to tend to discourage anyone else from playing a big minion a little bit, and it's also just going to get us started. The base isn't close enough to breaking for us to be in trouble. The Greek Grannies, meanwhile, are shuffling their big stuff back into their deck. So right now the score at Minnetonka is 5 for the Dinos to now 4 for the Greek Grannies and 3 for us. Although the Dinos only have 3 on their own turn. Okay. So we're behind 6-4-3, 8-4-3 on our turn. And with the base being 11 away from breaking, it's going to get into the danger zone if we play there. So as a result, we don't want to play anything at Lake Minnetonka, or we risk one of our opponents just dropping about 7 to 8 power, possibly pumping our Mimic up to a higher power than 3 in the process, and winning the game. Since either of them winning the base outright will win the game for them, we don't want to allow this, especially since we've got a deck that's got a little more reach than they do right now. The Greeks have had to reshuffle a lot of their good stuff. So the point of this playing Fledgling Vampire in the middle of nowhere, is that now with Back to the Future, we have the opportunity to destroy it and give ourselves an extra minion play later on. And then we're just going to use Mad Monster Party both to make the Fledgling Vampire hard to kill and to make our Mimic a little bigger and give us another chance. We can afford to go up +1 power on Minnetonka without anyone else being able to blow it up. By the way, the reason nobody has been playing at Castle Blood here is because Castle Blood's ability makes it very easy to counterattack there. And so even though it's an 18 as opposed to a 26, if I have a bunch of stuff on Castle Blood and you have a bunch of stuff on Lake Minnetonka, you're going to be much more capable of counterattacking at Castle Blood with the benefit of those extra +1 counters than I will at Minnetonka. And so you're generally going to be tactically better off at Minnetonka, which is why nobody's playing at Castle Blood right now. Also, there's no going up a point relative to one of your opponents for getting second place there, which is another reason you don't mind being last. Basically, each of the other two decks is failing to set up anything direct that immediately wins the game, so they're continuing the setup slowly. Now, this is a critical position. Castle Blood is 9 points away from breaking, and Lake Minnetonka currently we have 4, Greek Grannies have 4, and the Dino Sharks have 8. So it's 10 points away from breaking. How much can we make? Well, I'm going to pause the video here just in case I'm about to make the play. Mimic is going to be a 3. So would our other option. So both our minions are 3 power right now. So we can use either Genetic Shift or Back to the Future to gain an additional +3 with our action play. So as a result, we can use minion plus action play to add 6 power to one base or the other. That's not enough for us, so we can't directly break the base. Mitosis similarly would be another +3. We've basically got 4 different action cards that are all capable of adding +3. What would happen if we went to a 9-3-3 lead at Castle Blood? Well, we would be in a situation where we could win the game if neither of our opponents could make 7 power on one turn. But 7 power is an awfully low number to put the dinosaurs at being unable to make. So as a result, if we play the 9-3-3 lead at Castle Blood, we probably just lose the game. Oh, and I am aware that at Lake Minnetonka, we're going to actually be able to make 8 power instead of 6. But since we need 10 there, 8 isn't enough. If we went close to breaking Lake Minnetonka, we probably also lose to a Dinosaur's Burst involving augmentation, or any combination of various Greeks cards that can add a bunch of power. So as a result, we have to come up with a way to make it as hard as possible for our opponents to threaten something before we do. In this case, this is when we need to cash in our Big Gulp. We're going to hit the Hammerhead with the Big Gulp because that minion would grow if we played there, and as a result, that it ends up just killing the Hammerhead, ends up with less minion power in play for our opponents. We are also going to have to accept being a little bit tactically vulnerable here if we play anything, but by killing the Hammerhead and then playing 3 power on top of it, we at least end up no closer to the base breaking than we already were. Alright, so now we have a 6-3-0 lead at Castle Blood, which again requires one of our opponents to make it to 9 power in order to break it and win the game. With this play, we've also guaranteed sole possession of second place if either of our opponents have a winning hand. If the Greek Grannies have a winning hand, the Dinosaur Sharks aren't scoring their 15th VP to tie us, whereas if the Dinosaur Sharks have a winning hand, we already had a 1-point lead over the Greek Grannies. The Greek Grannies are going to go for it, but they're running into a problem specific to Grannies, Ignobles, and Wizards. They can break the base and win the game if they have the right card on top of their deck. In this case, they don't, but they needed to go for it anyway because this defensive kind of position never lasts forever in Smash Up. So now they're sitting on a 10-6 lead at Castle Blood. The Dinosaur Sharks are screwed. They need to play 11 to do anything about this, because if they break the base by playing something small, they're just going to end up tying for second place with the Greek Grannies winning 16-15-15. That's not really the result they want, so they don't want to touch Castle Blood. Of course, the problem is, if they can't make 11, we're going to break Castle Blood. So what they end up doing is the most sensible thing they can do. They dump as much power as they can on Lake Minnetonka. Those 3 minions they just played all have +1, but that only adds up to a total of 3 for Armor Stego, 8 for Hammerhead, 12 for War Raptor, 15, 18 for the Makos, 2-5 for us, 23 is not enough to break a 26 base, and as a result, that's it. They just have to watch and see what happens otherwise. The reason the play they made was better than just playing at Castle Blood and accepting a tie for second is, in this case, if we win the game at Castle Blood, they tie for second anyway. But we also have the option, maybe, of trying to break Lake Minnetonka and giving them full possession of second place. But in this case, all we do is just go to 14-10, win Castle Blood, and end up winning the game for the Vampire Shapeshifters. So in this game, the Vampire Shapeshifters played at VP-efficient bases, got good value out of Crack of Dusk, and eventually reached an endgame where they avoided the rookie mistake of overplaying at Lake Minnetonka and allowing an opponent to break the base and win the game. And then they eventually found that key defensive play involving Big Gulp that guaranteed them second place or better immediately, and also baited the Greek Grannies into going for a 50-50 gamble, which, in the end, the Vampire Shapeshifters won when the Greek Grannies didn't have an action on top of their deck. And that's how they won the game. They won the game. They won the game.